Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, Utah's leaders work through controversial issues as they tackle a record number of bills and prioritize funding requests. Legislators negotiate a compromise with the organizers of the redistricting ballot initiative. And voters begin to turn in their ballots as the state prepares for its first Super Tuesday. Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Amy Donaldson, reporter with the Deseret News, Bob Bernick, contributing editor at Utah Policy, and Spencer Stokes, president of Stokes Strategies. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I want to jump right into the legislative session. Week 5, about in the books. And I know it's risky to start talking about the budget at the start of a program, but that's where the fun is this year. Spencer, you're part of it, all right? The legislature has $800 million of funding, one-time and ongoing money. Tell us how those discussions are going and the current strategy.
Well, I think it's been an interesting kind of turn of events because they were planning on what had happened with tax reform. So they were talking about their budgets around that early on. And then when that changed immediately, they had to make a shift. And I think the big line we've heard from legislators over the last 5 weeks have been, there's no money. Yeah. There is no money.
I hear that a lot.
There's no money. And it comes down to this shift in, we thought we were going to have a different tax policy, and we're not going to. I think at the end of the day, things will be fine and everything will go along as planned, but that was a big shift for them to make all of a sudden at the beginning of the legislative session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, they have a heck of a lot of money. This is one of the largest surpluses they've ever had. The problem is they don't have a lot of money in the general fund, which is sales tax, and they have a whole lot of money in the education fund, which is income tax, mostly personal income tax. So the problem is that they can't move the money between the two funds because we have a constitutional earmark that says income taxes can only go to higher education and public education. That's the problem. They can't balance this stuff out.
Go ahead, Amy.
But they are using some of that money to fund. They have taken money from the general fund to fund higher ed, and they're going to use some of that education.
They've done that for years, and so they're taking some of that general fund money and pushing it out of higher ed and filling it back in with income tax money. But they can only do so much.
But I think they have a messaging issue as much as they have a money issue. A division of money issue, because I think the message. I'm not covering it every day like you guys are, so I'm not immersed in it. I'm a reader of the newspaper and watching it on TV, and I see all this. I see the largest surplus ever, and them saying, but we have to plan for a rainy day, and we're going to put this in a rainy day fund. We may not give you a tax cut because we might need to use it for a coronavirus response. And I feel an immense amount of frustration that there's not better communication about why they can't fund some of the things that we want to fund.
But this is Utahns love talking about rainy day funds. I will tell you, this is the first time in the history of my food storage that I've ever looked at it and thought, maybe this was a good idea to have this based on the coronavirus. But
you've obviously never missed a paycheck.
You're just going to eat flour?
I'm going to have flour and oatmeal. Okay. It's going to be a great thing. But people, Utahns, love rainy day funds, and I don't think that anyone will fault them for putting that, especially with what's going on in the stock market, the coronavirus. And I believe that messaging problem is a good one to have, that they're going to put money aside.
Well, so Bob, you've reported on this, right? On these rainy day funds. Describe a couple of those, because there are at least 2 or 3 of those funds are looking at.
There's 2 rainy day funds. There's one for the general fund, which they put in sales tax money into, and it's a percentage of how much extra money they have every year, because they've been running surpluses for a decade or so. The other one is the education fund. That's where the big one is. Now, I just looked at it the other day, and I think that the general fund is around $250 million, and the rainy day fund and the education fund is up around $571 million. That's a lot of money. So they've got a lot of money in there already, but there's a law that says they cannot go in and get it unless there's a fiscal emergency. And that means they got to take a vote and all of this stuff. So what Amy mentioned is they're talking about creating some new rainy day funds, which would be like checking accounts, savings accounts, so that you don't you could just pull it out whenever you want. And that's what they're talking about.
And a fire, like what California dealt with, and you can do.
Yeah, and they're also talking about using the rainy day fund to pay for student growth, the savings account, student growth, WPU, and for stuff like that they have to do every year. But if they have some extra money in there, and the virus brings down the economy and the income tax drops off because people are out of work, then they can get in it quicker.
And remember, the last time we changed the Constitution to allow higher ed to come in was during one of these crises when they needed to be able to pull more money out of the education fund to balance the needs of the state, which is how they sold it. And now, because of how they sold it, they're a little irritated that they went in. They should have just removed the earmark altogether. And there is an argument to be made that education would do much better if that earmark were removed, because then it's not this battle. They can actually prioritize education, and of course on the heels of a walkout today with education.
Yeah, I want to hit a couple of those points because they're very good. You've done, Amy, some great reporting on the coronavirus. It's interesting because one of the plans that at least some legislators were talking about is maybe a tax break, all right? Take some of this money, give it back, but as recently as yesterday, the governor here at PBS Utah is even talking about, well, maybe the coronavirus maybe even impact any of those kinds of plans.
Well, I think the first thing to know about the coronavirus, we don't know a lot. I just talked to an epidemiologist, a friend of mine, and they're still studying how the disease, what the incubation period is, how it spreads. It is an upper respiratory, so there seems to be you have to breathe it or have contact with saliva in some way. But there are some mysteries. We have a California, like one confirmed case where this person didn't have any contact with the normal, connections that you might have. But it is near Travis Air Force Base where they do have some, including 2 Utahns, quarantined. So I think the response has to be much more coordinated. I think that this is going to expose some flaws in our healthcare system. If people have to pay, there was a gentleman who went in and tried to get tested, and it cost him $3,500. And maybe this test needs to be part of maybe the money that the government has for something like this should be used to, if you can show that you have some connection, that you can get a test for free. I mean, obviously there are people going to go in and say, I have a cold, please test me for coronavirus, because they're scared. But the reality is that we don't have independently confirmed cases except for that one. But they're still figuring it out, and I'm convinced they don't have the incubation period right. I have been covering this since the cruise ship was quarantined on February 5th, and I'm convinced they don't know. And the other thing to consider is if people without insurance go to work, because they won't get a paycheck if they don't go to work, anyone can be infected. You buy food at a grocery store, the people who stock those shelves, they're workers who don't normally have insurance or days off. And those are all things that we have to consider when you're talking about something.
But the governor's right.
Right. Yeah.
The governor is right. In this kind of a situation, I would be cautious and prudent, and we may need that. Because, as you mentioned, we've never seen this kind of thing before in our modern history, where everybody is asked to stay home. And you can imagine what that's going to do to an economy. And so,
well, think about it. In China, kids are not even allowed to go to school. Their stores are shut down, and they are just barely seeing a drop in the rate of infection. And Japan is on the rise, and they're now saying you can't go to school. And in China, you're looking at months of kids being out of school. Stores and restaurants. I mean, we're already having shortages. I went to an IHC facility yesterday, and they won't hand out masks because there's
they run out of masks
shortage.
in a lot of places. They are worried about it, and justifiably so, but there are political reasons why they don't want to give a tax cut. And because with all this money out there that they've got, they could easily give a tax cut. And one would think in an election year, all 75 House members, half of the 29-member Senate, they're all up for election. Normally, they would give a tax cut with all of this huge surplus they got. But there's hurt feelings up on Capitol Hill, hurt feelings over tax reform.
So you're saying they want to punish us?
Only you. They only want to punish issue. But they,
legislators don't get hurt feelings, Bob.
yeah,
I
they
can't
do.
believe you're talking
they
about
do.
that.
And so they're not. There's some unhappy puppies up there, is what I'm saying, and they don't. And so that's part of it too. It's not. Some of the stuff is an overreaction perhaps, but they have other reasons for not giving a tax cut.
I just want to ask one more about this, Spencer, because you follow it so closely. This huge amount of money going to the education fund and not so much in the general fund. This issue has not been fixed, right? So legislators are still talking about that, right? So is there a plan right now to fix that? Because this is what they've been saying all along: is they've got to fix this very problem.
It's a difficult thing to fix because the only way you're going to fix this is if the education community comes on board with fixing this. And I don't see them coming on board with fixing it. There is a lack of trust amongst the education community and the legislature. I think it's somewhat overblown, the lack of trust both ways. It's going both ways. So the only way you get a constitutional amendment passed is if education stands up and says, we need this. And they view this earmark as a sacred thing to them. Yeah. That it's their money. I don't know how you get it passed, and I've said this repeatedly. Only way you can do is go make a deal with them. And how do you make a deal when the education community knows you can't bind future legislative sessions, or leaders? So how do you do that? It's almost impossible.
Well, one alternative is you take away the earmark, but then you put a bunch of other guarantees in the Constitution, which you generally don't want to do because that's how they got in this problem in the first place.
Right.
But if you put into the Constitution that you're going to have, I don't know, this much growth every year, guaranteed, there's other ways you can do it. Language has been proposed.
They don't like doing that.
No.
Yeah. They like doing that in statute, not in
that's right.
But I think the real issue is the lack of trust. And I think that the legislature has, as an unbiased person watching this and covering education for many years, they have beaten up on educators and public education so much that they don't feel like they have even a seat at the power of table. And every issue that comes up, like let's just look at Medicaid expansion, they use education as the battering ram. It's the club they hold over their head. If you want this, we have to cut education. If you want roads, we have to cut education. Stop using education as the club that you're going to hit everybody with, and then maybe you can rebuild that trust.
The trust, though, has not come from the budgetary side because the legislature has been good to education
it's
budgetarily.
Rules.
It's the other 125 bills that get introduced that nitpick at the education community.
That tell a teacher how to do their job from Capitol Hill.
And sadly, and this is a question that I think should be on everyone's mind during this gubernatorial season and debates, the governance of the State Board of Education needs to be reformed. The State Board of Education has no power to push back toward the legislature because the governor that can veto education bills in the legislature has no role in education other than that. And so it's got to be fixed. And if you were to say to me, what constitutional horse would you ride this go around? I would be more in favor of fixing governance in the Constitution than I would anything else of education, because it's at the heart of the dysfunction. There's 400 hands on the wheel, and it's not a good way to drive a car.
Yeah, but they've also just made the State Board of Education partisan.
Yes.
So now we're going to elect our 15-member board, which most people don't know these people. We're going to elect them as Republicans or as Democrats. That means there's going to be
always helps. That adds. That always solves every problem.
And that's not going to help anything. No. And there's been bills to try to fix that in the given. And Herbert has said, I want more power. The governor should have more power, and the legislature just thumbs their noses at that because what little power they have, which is the budget, which is the money. They're going to
every governor runs on education, and every governor is lying about it when they're running on education.
Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about people who are running for just a moment, because we've been following so many interesting stories about how people get elected. The Proposition 4, all right? Budget was about one of these initiatives, referendums. So is this one. So Amy, let's talk about this for a second, because a compromise was reached this week on Prop 4, which many people didn't realize was still kind of in the balance.
Yeah, these guys were up there, and they can tell you a little bit more about the compromise. But I think just the idea that the compromise was in process was very alarming to people who voted. The people who went out and got those petitions signed were part of that proposition effort, and because they already feel betrayed on the other propositions that were reworked. And I think that just the idea that they were going to sit down and discuss this with the legislature that they don't trust was very alarming.
Let's talk about
it made it
the trust
difficult
part.
to even get information.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Spencer, you're part of these discussions. Tell us about that trust factor that Amy was just talking about there, and kind of a little piece of the compromise that they found, that both sides seem to be okay with this.
Well, this has been going on for a year and a half. That right after it passed, a group of us sat down and started having discussions, and they were very productive. They were heated on both sides, and both sides felt like they were right. I have to applaud Better Boundaries and the legislature that they basically put a gag order on themselves when we ended last legislative session and didn't have a solution, and we agreed we would come back this year and talk more about it, and both sides were respectful of that. Both sides didn't talk about it in the press or in the public, and then we came back right first week of this legislative session and met twice a week up until this point. And look, Better Boundaries got some things they wanted, and the legislature got some things they wanted. But redistricting in this state is mainly a perception issue that there's bad things going on. There just are not enough. It's not an it's not an even balanced state as far as Republicans and Democrats. And so the only gerrymandering that could go on is to round up every Democrat that lived in any place in the state of Utah and draw, it'll look like cheese curds to put a congressional district together that would work. That would be the only way you could really gerrymander. There's just too many Republicans.
But there's too many. There's some really good stuff they could do, which they haven't done. And the most obvious thing to do is, because right now Chris Stewart represents the Salt Lake City, most of Salt Lake City. They are totally disenfranchised. Okay, with Chris Stewart. I won't go into all about what he's done with Trump and everything else. So they're disenfranchised. Salt Lake City is disenfranchised. So they could just go and start, and maybe they can with this new independent commission. They could take the northern boundary of Salt Lake City and just push south until you get 850,000 people, or how many you need, and then that would be one district. Now, it would still be a Republican-leaning district, but it would be much less so, because right now Chris Stewart's up around 17% plus Republican. So it could be down around 5 or 6% Republican, and that would be much fairer for the Democrats. There are ways that you can do it.
The nice thing about
the biggest issue for me, though, you talk about the process, is that the legislative process, the redistricting process after 2010 was bipartisan in the state, at the state level.
At the legislature.
And then at the legislature. And then when it went to the federal level, it was all Republican. And that's what I think people on the outside really have an issue with. It's that if you're doing it behind, you could be the nicest, greatest, most altruistic people behind closed doors. I still want to see the process. I want it to be bipartisan.
Well, this is really all about the congressional districts.
It is.
All about that. But it's still, people have a perception that there's nefarious things going on, and this is going to clean that up. There will be an opportunity.
To some extent it is.
Yeah, but it brings it out in the daylight. The commission, which will be appointed, has a list of rules they should follow, like keeping communities of interest together.
Yeah. Yes.
But I do think the gag order that you all imposed on yourselves actually hurt you in communicating with the public, because everyone was the general public is blindsided. What we assume, we're immersed in this universe every day, that people know what we know, and they don't. And there is a distrust and a sense of panic, and there are a lot of disenfranchised people who just don't trust the process. They just don't see it as fair.
So, Bob, on a couple of these great points on the process Amy just brought up, and a couple of things that they've changed that seem to be, getting some favors. One is they've changed how the maps worked, right? It used to be the Independent Redistricting Commission would submit maps, you could vote for them or not, but now it's sort of an optional, all right? You can
they put in, the Utah Constitution says that, like all state constitutions, the legislature will redistrict. So they couldn't change that. They can't change the Constitution in Utah via initiative. Okay, that can only be done through the legislature.
That was the argument about the constitutionality of it, right?
Oh, okay. That was part of it. They also had some other weird stuff, like the Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court was going to pick maps if you couldn't make a decision. And so you don't want to get the different branches of government all messed up and all this. So there are other problems. But what it is now, it's going to be a recommendation. They can send up one map, the independent commission, one map, 3 maps, whatever, and then the legislature will look at them and say, no, or yes. Although it may change it a little bit. Now, again, on the legislative districts, which has some real games played in the past, on the legislative district, it's not that much of a deal because you almost get Democratic votes. Almost always some of the Democrats. Why? Because they take care of the Democrats in some area. They're all taking care of each other. Biggest conflict in state government is redistricting. People don't understand that.
Well, because you're deciding how you're going to hold on to your power.
You're picking your own voters instead of your voters picking you.
But they funded $1 million for this.
They did.
Which is big.
Which is nice, and they should do it. And there is an independent redistricting commission, so we're all going to get it. But they had a bunch of really odd things in there in their proposition, which forced the legislature to do what the district commission was going to do. They've taken those all out. So it's only going to be a recommendation. And by the way, anybody.
That's all it ever was.
That's all it ever was. But it was all a recommendation. But it was pretty tough to vote against it. Then under the original.
You had to vote it up or down.
Yeah, had to vote. They don't have to vote it up or down. They don't have to vote it up or down now. So anyway, it has some of the teeth been taken out, sure, but it's still a good thing, and it's still going to be tough for these guys, the next legislature, to do something really weird with U.S. House seats. It's going to be tougher to do that, and it'll be a big PR problem. But we've just gone through tax reform. Do these people care about a big PR problem?
They do. They do care.
Okay. I don't care as much as
not enough.
That seems like a perfect segue to our talk about the presidential, the presidential candidates, in Utah, but Super Tuesday in particular, because this is a big deal for us in Utah.
It is.
Amy, let's talk about it. First time ever. It's this coming Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
We are part of it. How big of a deal is it for Utah that we are with these other 13 states on this day, kind of voting on these candidates?
I think if you look at just the vote by mail and the vote in person numbers, I mean, I think people are extremely excited about it. They're extremely excited to be part of it. I think you have Bernie Sanders is coming. He's going to have a rally here on Monday. You've had a number of other presidential candidates come here. Bloomberg, Mayor Pete, Elizabeth Warren came last year. So I mean, it puts you in the thick of it, and so it's exciting, and I think it's definitely energized people. I think Bernie has something similar that President Trump has, and it's this really solid, really dedicated base that almost anything he does or says doesn't matter. They believe in his philosophy, his core philosophy so much that they're with him 100%, and it doesn't matter what he says at a debate or doesn't do. And I just think it's a really exciting. I wish that the entire primary season was condensed, and that we didn't have to, that 2 or 3 communities weren't narrowing this field down, that we all got to choose from whatever the field was at the beginning.
I always make a definitive statement on this show so that I can apologize later about it. But Bernie Sanders will be the nominee, and there are other consequences to Bernie being the nominee, and I believe that consequence is that the House flips and we retain the Senate if Bernie's the nominee.
You're saying we, you mean Republicans?
The Republicans. That's because I'm a Republican.
Okay. Go ahead, Bob. People might not know that.
I think
ladies and gentlemen, I'm a Republican.
Okay.
If I'm going to scoot over.
Let's get some consolidation on this end.
The virus could be anywhere. There'd be a political virus. I think if Bernie Sanders is the nominee, that he loses. And if there's somebody else that's the nominee and Bernie can't convince all the Bernie bros to come and be active and vote, then that's a real problem too. But the United States is a right-leaning country. and we're not going to vote for a
Don't
Democratic
tell Nancy
socialist.
Pelosi that, Bob.
Yeah,
So-
well, I mean,
So I disagree with both of you, and in full disclosure, I've registered as a Republican, so I can vote in the governor's race because.
Okay, so you feel affiliated for that?
Well, we have a really interesting field of candidates for governor, and I feel like that's more important, actually, to be connected to your
Well, you
local
better not
races.
go to your wine and cheese club
But-
if you've registered as a Republican.
like wine
they're
or
gonna,
cheese, so
They're going to
how's
rat
that?
you out.
But I
out.
think that say I don't know who's going to win the Democratic nomination because of the superdelegate situation.
Yeah.
So I think that I think Bernie will win in Utah. I think he'll win. He'll get the most votes here. But what will happen? I don't know. I think there's too much left in play. There's a lot happening in the world, and there's a lot happening here. I'm definitely a person that says just get engaged in whatever way you can.
Let me give you the numbers since you just said that, because
Yeah.
we have a poll we just released this morning
Okay.
with the Deseret News. I want to give you these numbers with your take on this. Bernie Sanders, 28%, Bloomberg, 19, Buttigieg, 18, Warren, 15, 6% Biden, Klobuchar, 4, only 8% don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, this Bernie in Utah, I mean, he won by 79% in our caucuses in 2016.
Yeah.
So
I actually think that Bernie is the only candidate that will give Donald Trump a run for his money, and I'll tell you why. Because I walked in Market Street Grill 4 years ago, and the Democrats were meeting there, and Peter Caroon waved me in and said, "Hey, tell us who we should support." I said, well, there's way more energy around Bernie Sanders than any of your other candidates. And the interesting thing about superdelegates, because of the last Democratic convention, a lot of modifications were made to how those superdelegates.
they only get to vote the second round.
How they are played, and that benefits Bernie. And I believe that the energy, it's the Donald Trump equivalent to the Republican Party right now. He is the person exciting the base, and so it'll be interesting.
yeah, that's going to be the last comment on that, but we get to see that on Tuesday. Thank you so much for your great insights tonight. We appreciate it. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate you being with us. We'll see you next week.